Well, my name is Timothy Vilijamson. I'm a professor of logic at Oxford University, and I also teach at Yale University for a little bit of each year. I'm here in Belgrade in order to receive an honorary doctorate from the University of Belgrade, where I've had a lot of contacts with philosophers in the faculty here for more than 30 years. Philosophy is very international. Of course, every philosophy department to some extent studies the history of philosophy in that country and so on. But actually, the kind of syllabus that is taught in Belgrade is very recognizable for somebody coming from Britain, or somebody who's used to philosophy in other European countries. I mean, 30 years ago, I think the philosophy here was more influenced by the German tradition, and increasingly it's come to be more connected with the Anglo-American tradition of analytic philosophy, phenomenon that I've noticed in recent philosophy, where people put forward very, very radical views, and it seems like the best objections to these views would come either from just common sense or from modern science, but where often the most effective objections in practice, the ones that worry these proponents of these views most, are not ones from common sense or modern science, but ones from cases which have some kind of special emotive or moral significance. So, for example, one of these kind of views is relativism, which is the idea that there's no absolute truth, that something may be true for you and not for me, or vice versa, and then there's no one right answer independent of the individual or the society or the perspective. And you'd think that examples from modern science or common sense would be the most obvious objections to this, but those are not the ones that worry the relativists. The ones that really seem to worry them more are objections from, for example, from the fact that they seem to be saying that what Holocaust deniers are saying is true for them, but even if it's false for us, and that there's no right answer as to whether the Holocaust really took place, and it's because the Holocaust is an event of such moral significance. Relativists, I think, are more uneasy about proposing a relativist view in a case like that, where it could easily have some kind of political, well, it obviously does have some kind of political significance. And so I was discussing a number of examples of that kind. Another one would be with philosophical skepticism, and the way that skeptics who are kind of happy with the standard objections, I mean, they don't feel particularly worried by standard objections to skepticism, but they do feel worried when it's pointed out that one application of philosophical skepticism is skepticism about climate change, and particularly man-made climate change. And these morally loaded cases are a reminder that actually even these very general theoretical views in philosophy, like skepticism and relativism, they actually have practical consequences, and you can't just isolate them from the rest of life. It reminds me, I once heard a lecture when I was a professor in Edinburgh from a visiting Nietzsche scholar, who was talking about how Nietzsche's philosophy is not just some kind of academic theory, but if you take it seriously, it transforms your life, and because it's so radical, and everything will be different for you. And then in the discussion period, one of the students asked this speaker, the question, well, you're saying that if you take Nietzsche's philosophy seriously, then it completely transforms your life and you can no longer live an ordinary conventional life. And yet here you are, a professor of philosophy, giving a lecture to a student philosophy society in a completely standard sort of way. And then he got very sort of huffy and said, I don't see the relevance of that question. But everybody else could see the relevance of it because this was something where he was claiming that this was a very radical view, and yet which transformed your life, and yet his life seemed to be the same as the life of any other philosophy professor. Another kind of challenge that I like is that, I mean, recently I've published a couple of more popular books, Tetralogue and another called Doing Philosophy, which are aimed at a more general audience. And I think people sometimes think, well, if these are more general books, then they'll be much easier to write. But in fact, they're equally challenging to write that kind of thing, because you have to find a way of explaining without taking much for granted technical things in a way which makes them clear and doesn't falsify them or dumb them down, and and in a style which makes them interesting. And so that in its way is just as much a challenge to writing as in writing for a much more academic audience with a lot of technical background that you can just take for granted. The last book of mine that was published, that came out in the summer. It's a book called Doing Philosophy from Common Curiosity to Logical Reasoning. So that's one of the ones that I mentioned, which is intended for a popular readership, and it's really designed to explain how philosophy is capable of finding things out, even though it doesn't do experiments in the way that we would expect from natural science. All children go through a stage where they keep asking why about different things, and someone said that the philosophers are the people who never grow out of that stage. So in that sense, there's a little bit of a philosopher in everybody. And part of what I was trying to show in the book is that the kinds of questions that philosophers ask, they're not radically different from the kinds of question that just ordinary people want to ask about, what's this, and they might be asking, what light is, or what time is, or what space is, and you can very easily be led into these philosophical questions. So I mean, part of it was to emphasize that philosophy is not some kind of way of thinking that's totally different from anything that we do in ordinary life, that it's actually quite firmly based in commonsensical and scientific ways of thinking. But I also wanted to explain to people what in practice philosophy is like, what it feels like to be studying philosophy or engaged in some kind of philosophical inquiry. At the moment, I'm working on a book on conditionals and on statements of the form, if you do this, then that will happen, or that sort of thing. And there's a huge debate about the meaning of conditional statements, which in fact it goes back to the ancient Greeks. I think there was a poet, Callimachus, who said that in Alexandria, which was of course one of the big centers of Greek philosophy, even the crows on the rooftops are cawing about conditionals, and in fact the theory of conditionals that I'm going to be defending in this book is one which already existed in ancient times. A lot of my work in philosophy has not just with this book, but with some of my previous books, has been based on the idea that simple ideas are often, in fact, the correct ones. But people have rejected them, not stupidly, but because there seems to be lots of evidence which these simple ideas can't explain. And I think people have just not been sufficiently resourceful in exploring the capacity of simple ideas to explain apparently very negative phenomena for them. And that once you take into account a lot of limitations on our capacity to get knowledge, you can see that it's really those limitations on our own knowledge faculties that explain these negative data, and that you can actually defend very simple theories as correct, but just you have to understand that the relation between theory and evidence is complicated in philosophy in the same way as it's complicated in the natural sciences, where you can't just take raw data. You have to have a more sophisticated attitude to the kind of errors that the data is susceptible to.